Well, it's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here. I've had the pleasure of working with the IRLA for many years, and I have not been terminated from the board yet, although my attendance record is a little bit weak. I live quite a ways from Silver Springs. But I've learned a tremendous amount over the years from the IRLA, the way it works so well with people from many faiths in many parts of the world, and I salute this organization for its good work. Freedom of religion or belief is fundamental to the structure of peace building. Without it, no society can be fully just, and processes aimed at achieving stable and lasting peace are necessarily incomplete. The fundamental human right has long been considered a critical tool for ending and averting religious warfare, but it also provides necessary footings needed to begin crystallizing peace out of conflict. Let's see if I can. Now, one of the things that has to be said, though, is that this is a counterintuitive right. It's important to recognize this because it often remains counterintuitive to government leaders and others guiding government policy today. So I'm going to spend some time talking about just why it is counterintuitive, and then I'll turn to explanations of why it nonetheless holds the keys to sustainable development. Religious freedom appeared relatively late as a political ideal because it was not only counterintuitive, it was quite literally unthinkable. Religious homogeneity was, in pre-modern assumptions, assumed to be crucial to social stability. Religious dissent embodied the seeds of social disintegration. Religious conformity must be coerced, in this view, to assure social peace. Religious pluralism was experienced as the antithesis of sustainable peace and the seedbed of sedition, treason, and civil war. In significant ways, the Enlightenment account of religious pluralism extended the pre-modern view. Religious pluralism came to be accepted as a historical fate, but as a dangerous fate that had to be controlled. According to the Enlightenment narrative, the Enlightenment invented a dichotomy between the religious and the secular, and constructed religion as an irrational and dangerous impulse that must give way in public to rational secular forms of power. This was implemented, as suggested yesterday, by Blandine Cellini-Pont in the Treaty of Westphalia, and it continues to form one of the major arguments that religion should be relegated to the private sphere. Now, we heard from Brian Grimm yesterday, and he has long worked to show that religious freedom is not only correlated with countless other social goods, but that there is a causal relationship, that religious freedom is a cause of many of these other social goods. But that's not always easy to document. One of the ways he did that in an earlier article was to show that there is a kind of cyclic pattern, what we could call the religious freedom cycle, where if a country grants religious freedom, that makes for broader religious participation, that generates many positive results in society, that reinforces the value of religious freedom, and then you get a very positive cycle. So that's one way that religious freedom could be a causative agent. His work also identified a religious violence cycle that's shown here. In The Price of Freedom Denied, he presented much more detailed statistical analysis, but you get the basic picture here. If there are social restrictions on religious freedom, that creates pressures for government restrictions, but it turns out that government restrictions are often one of the primary causes of violence. And if you have violence, that generates further social restrictions, and the cycle goes on in a negative direction. Now, one of the things that Brian's work shows is that this is counterintuitive, but policymakers need to understand this, because if you don't take this into account, there's a real risk that restrictive measures designed to throttle religious violence may actually make it worse. But note, one of the risks is that this cycle can spin out of control. The increasing social and governmental constraints can be natural if counterproductive sources of polarization amplification. Now, there's thus a standard account of religious of pluralism, according to which sociological pluralism is rooted in divergent religious views. Religion involves transcendent values, treasured more than life itself. It generates loyalties that run deeper than ties to any earthly sovereign. And because these differences are deep and non-negotiable, they lead to intractable conflicts. Religious freedom then becomes a tool that emerged from the cauldron of post-Reformation religious wars to quell the violence. That's the standard picture. A friend of mine, Andras Shayo, who just completed a term as Vice President of the European Court of Human Rights, described a broader phenomenon that he described as the tragedy of liberty. And his point was this: liberty is fragile since its psychosocial support is weak. The problem is that other political passions all too often strengthen demands for restricting liberty. Liberty is little appreciated while its discomforts are immediately felt. The sources of this tragedy are many. Some include the fact that freedom does not cater enough goodies. Therefore, we get welfare state constraint. Liberty erodes some social bonds. The freedom to consume is another kind of freedom, but it's different than the negative freedom that protects religious freedom from the state. We have also what you could call freedom of the body. What was once called license takes precedence over religious freedom. Think of calls for subordination of religious freedom to demands of sexual politics. The conformity to majoritarian will can also take priority over deeper principles of freedom. All of these things can lead to the erosion of liberty and further problems. I think of this, maybe in light of the sort of Russian start, as what you could call the Grand Inquisitor syndrome. You will remember that in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, there is a story of the Grand Inquisitor who imprisons a returning Christ, and the Inquisitor argues that the masses would prefer bread to the burden of freedom. The result in modern societies is that freedom in general and religious freedom in particular ends up being eroded by the various forms that bread can take. Religious freedom continues to receive lip service until other passions prevail. That's part of the counterintuitive character of religious liberty. Another argument along these lines is Tocqueville's insight, speaking of the hazards of equality. He said, "Equality, which brings great benefits into the world, nevertheless suggests to men some very dangerous propensities. It tends to isolate them from each other, to concentrate every man's attention upon himself, and it lays open the soul to an inordinate love of material gratification." Now, Tocqueville saw that in many ways the answer to this is religion. He spoke of the benefits of religion in many passages, but this one is useful. There is no religion, he says, which does not place the object of man's desires above and beyond the treasures of earth, and which does not naturally raise his soul to regions far above those of the senses. Nor is there any which does not impose on man some sort of duties to his kind, and thus draws him at times from the contemplation of himself. Thus, Tocqueville sees religion as a key to stable democracy. From a secular Enlightenment perspective, however, it is precisely the pull of the transcendent that makes religion hazardous. It is the one passion that is strong enough to overcome the tragedy of liberty, to remind people why liberty of all kinds is so important. But by its nature, religion is something that cannot be controlled by typical secular inducements, because they are all inducements from this world, and religion calls to people from beyond this world. It is something that people care about more than life itself, and certainly more than the comforts of life. The challenge is to determine how this great spiritual force can become a source of sustainable stability rather than a source of destabilizing division. So, while there is some counterintuitive pull to religion and religious liberty, it's clear that it is the oldest and perhaps the most paradoxical of human rights. It demands that we have respect for the rights of others to live out their beliefs, even though we may disagree with them. But it has proven itself as the most effective tool we have for managing deep difference. What makes FORB necessary for securing sustainable peace in the context of deep pluralism is precisely this paradoxical character of this right. A great statement of this is one of the leading cases in the European Court of Human Rights, which says, while it is possible that tension is created in situations where a religious or any other community becomes divided, that is, when the conditions of pluralism begin to prevail, this is one of the unavoidable consequences of pluralism. The role of the authorities in such circumstances is not to remove the cause of tension by eliminating pluralism, but to ensure that the competing groups tolerate each other. So what I want to do is talk about how this is done and why religious freedom is so important in this process. The key insight came from the philosopher John Locke. Much can be said about this, but the fundamental point is that he recognized that respecting difference could breed loyalty and therefore stability. The Lockean insight found its way into American founding documents through Jefferson and Madison and has become a time-tested tool ever since. Now, in some ways, the Lockean notion needs to be adjusted. Locke was writing early and didn't realize, he really thought that the rule of law would be enough to solve problems. And in fact, we've learned that legislative bodies can draft legislation in ways that a neutral and general law may nonetheless create problems for specific groups. And we have a kind of consensus somewhat modeled in filed up a little bit in the United States, but emphasizing the importance that there's more than just the rule of law that we need to protect religious freedom. There are some further revisions to Locke that one could keep in mind. Sometimes people think of religious freedom as making exceptions to normal statutes, and that sounds unequalitarian. But maybe we should think about the fact that we need to look from a deeper perspective. In reality, what's happening is sometimes laws are invading space that is protected by constitutional and higher level norms, and it's not a violation, but a bringing laws into conformity with something higher. But in any event, what is needed is a tightening of the limitations on religious freedom, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try and go quickly here. But I think it's important to recognize that the Enlightenment narrative that the violence comes from religion is really exaggerated. Like romantic love, religion is deeply implicated in much that is highest, but also much that is lowest in the human condition, and we have to take that into account. But in fact, the religions are no more inclined to violence than secular ideologies. Religions are not more absolutist, divicist, or irrational, and there is really no way to separate religion and secular violence. Moreover, if you look at things historically, it's true that there were religious wars, but a lot of those wars weren't really just religious wars. They were really the effort of the emerging national state to assert itself, so that in some ways they're really a proof of the Brian Grimm and the Lockean kind of notions that if you have too much pressure, this causes problems. So we talked yesterday about Brian Grimm, so I'm going to skip past these things. I think the major point that I want to make is that the fundamental problem is not that we need homogeneity in society. Everyone has fears of other groups, and it is those fears that trigger majoritarian efforts to dominate and minority fears. And what we need is the assurance that one's own dignity and worldview will be protected, and that's what freedom of religion does. What we need is not secularism as an ideology as a solution, but a kind of inclusive framework of secularity that accepts religion, does not ban it from the public sphere, but welcomes different views and gives them assurance that they will be safe. There are many ways that religious freedom promotes all kinds of social goods. This is one of the key charts from the Brian Grimm Price of Freedom Denied book, showing the broad range of places where where religion makes contributions. Obviously, it promotes altruism. It contributes to the material foundations of sustainable peace, builds social capital. The religious factor is really important in advancing the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. There are a variety of productive virtues. It helps expand the range of religious peacemakers in society, opens channels of dialogue and negotiation, protects religious communities, provides buffers between the individual and the state, helps form identity, helps confer meaning, helps envision the highest goods for society. In conclusion, religious freedom is vital and a tested tool for diffusing polarization and fear. It's an important filtering mechanism to filter out the problems that religion sometimes provides, but safeguard the positive contribution that it makes. It helps assure that religion can contribute to conflict resolution and stability, and in an increasingly pluralized world, provides our best hope for achieving sustainable peace. Thank you.